Released in 1997 for the Nintendo 64, San Francisco Rush is a port of the famous arcade racer of the same name that came out a year earlier. The original arcade game was developed and released by Atari Games, and the Nintendo 64 port was handled by Midway. On a side note, Rush was also released on the PlayStation in 1998 by Climax Studios, but the conversion job done on it pales in comparison next to Midway's excellent job on the Nintendo 64. San Francisco Rush is a pretty intensely paced racing game, and there are quite a few unique aspects to Rush that separate it from the hordes of other arcade-style racers out there. Firstly, there are a pretty nice amount of cars available right off the bat in the Nintendo 64 version of the game, with hidden and unlockable cars available by meeting certain conditions. Each car has a default difficulty rating applied to it, whether it be beginner, advanced, expert, or extreme. Each one handles a little bit differently, and the fastest cars in the game are usually labeled as the extreme cars. My personal favorite is the Extreme All-Stick car, which you'll see me using almost exclusively in this review. All of the cars in Rush are useful in their own right, and it's really about finding the one you're the most comfortable with. There are a total of 6 tracks to choose from, and one unlockable track from the Alcatraz arcade game as well that can be accessed by playing through the Nintendo 64 exclusive Circuit mode, and each one can be played in a mirror mode or in reverse, which adds a pretty good amount of diversity. One thing you'll notice about San Francisco Rush is how absolutely crazy the races get. The game is most famous for its crazy jumps, cars that explode, and of course, the numerous shortcuts that can be found on every track. The shortcuts in Rush provide some excellent ways to pull ahead in a race, and they're always a blast to find and use. It's kind of a gamble though, since even though it may put you a couple places ahead, they're usually still much harder to successfully get out of in one piece than just driving the course normally. It's a great feeling though to pull it off and see yourself jump up a couple of positions, especially near the end of a race. On top of the single race and circuit modes, there's also a really cool practice mode that will let you run through the length of the course without having to worry about a strict time limit or the other cars. Since Rush really relies on a lot of trial and error and of course exploration, the practice mode is incredibly useful. It really helps to drive around and eyeball a lot of the shortcuts on the track before attempting to race it for real. Another thing that's exclusive to the Nintendo 64 version of the game are all of the hidden keys that are scattered all over the tracks. These end up being added to a running total and unlock extra cars that can be raced on each course. The thing is, these keys are insanely well hidden. Here's an example of a key that can be grabbed on track 2. And that one's not an exception either. Here's another one that's really difficult to find. So basically, you're really going to have to hunt these things down if you want to try and collect all of the available cars, and they're definitely not easy to find. The good news is, you can do your hunting in practice mode, so you know exactly where they all are when it comes time to pick them up during a race. The graphics in San Francisco Rush are pretty good for the Nintendo 64. The draw distance is obviously a little toned down from the arcade original, but overall, everything is represented pretty well. The tracks are all huge and are fairly detailed, and all of the arcade shortcuts are accounted for. As with most Nintendo 64 games, it does look a little bit blurry when it comes to the texturing, but Midway did a fantastic job with the graphics for the most part, and definitely made good use of the hardware. The cars look good, as do the wild explosions that seem to take place constantly, and it's still super satisfying to land those massive jumps successfully. The sound in Rush is fairly accurate in comparison to the arcade original, although obviously downsampled quite a bit in order to fit all of it onto the cartridge. The sounds of the crashes and explosions are nice, and everything is pretty balanced in terms of the sound effects. The music, on the other hand, is terrible. This is most definitely one of those games that's much better if you have some sort of background noise or music going on. It's all incredibly annoying to listen to, but that's not really the Nintendo 64's fault. The arcade version has the same soundtrack. The difference is that the arcade version was always so loud that you couldn't really hear the music that well, whereas with the Nintendo 64 version, it's much more noticeable. Thankfully, Rush controls really well on the 64. By default, you'll be using the A and B buttons to accelerate and brake, and the analog stick is used to steer the car. The D-pad is used to change your camera angle, and of course the upper C button is also used to respawn your car when you explode into a ball of fire, which will happen quite a bit. These days, a lot of the analog sticks on the Nintendo 64 controller seem to be giving out, so make sure you've got a decent one before dropping the cash on San Francisco Rush. I used to play Rush quite a bit back in the arcade days, and was really psyched to see a port coming out on the Nintendo 64 at the time. It's a really fun game that has a life of its own in comparison to the other racers on the system, and even ended up spawning 2 more sequels on the 64. Graphically, it may not have aged that well, but it's still a ton of fun to play. I highly recommend picking this one up if you don't have it already. Rush will only cost you a couple of bucks at the very most, and if you do enjoy it, I highly recommend picking up its sequels, Rush 2 and of course Rush 2049 on the 64 as well. They're all a ton of fun. As always guys, thank you for watching and subscribing. Until next time, stay classic.